They were recruited under a tropical sun, along a coastline shaped by trade winds and surf, not by the sound of artillery. The rhythms of daily life in the Gold Coast were set by markets, harvests, and the movement of ships, not by war. Yet when Britain declared war in September 1939, the Gold Coast Regiment was already being drawn into a conflict that would carry its men thousands of miles from home toward a front few in West Africa had ever heard described in detail. The Gold Coast, Britain's West African colony, entered the Second World War without the immediate shock felt in Europe. There were no air raids, no blackouts, no columns of refugees. Life continued outwardly unchanged, markets still opened at dawn. Cocoa still moved inland toward railheads and then to the ports. Ships still crossed the Atlantic. But beneath this surface continuity, the machinery of empire was beginning to turn faster. The British Army was stretched across continents. Its commitments ranged from Europe to the Middle East, from India to Africa. Manpower shortages were already clear. Once again, West Africa, long used as a source of labor and soldiers, became a critical reserve. Colonial authorities were instructed to expand recruitment quickly, efficiently, and with minimal disruption to economic production. By late 1939 and early 1940, recruitment for the Gold Coast Regiment intensified. Some men volunteered willingly. Regular pay was attractive in uncertain times. For others, military service followed family traditions that stretched back to earlier colonial campaigns. The promise of travel and steady rations also carried weight, but recruitment was not uniform. In some districts, pressure from chiefs and colonial administrators played a role. Wartime urgency narrowed the space for refusal. Enthusiasm varied widely, and it was uneven across regions and communities. From the perspective of military planners in London and Nairobi, these differences mattered less than results. What counted was speed, physical fitness, and the ability to train large numbers quickly. By early 1940, existing battalions were expanded and reorganized. New drafts arrived at training depots. Instruction focused on discipline, route marching, weapon handling, and fieldcraft. The emphasis was practical rather than theoretical. Soldiers were trained to move long distances, maintain formation, and operate under basic field conditions. There was still little focus on the enemy they would face. Italian forces in East Africa were known only in broad terms. Intelligence summaries described their numbers and positions, but there was a general belief that time remained before serious fighting would begin. The war still felt distant. That assumption ended on the 10th of June 1940, when Italy entered the war. With that declaration, Italian East Africa, stretching across modern Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somaliland, became an active military threat. British-controlled Kenya and Sudan suddenly faced hostile borders. The East African theatre was no longer hypothetical. It was open, and it demanded immediate attention. British commanders now required trained infantry capable of operating over vast distances with limited infrastructure. Defensive plans had to be strengthened, and preparations for counter-offensives began at once. For the Gold Coast Regiment, the shift was swift and unmistakable. Orders were issued to prepare selected battalions for overseas movement. The journey itself became a military operation. Troops moved from inland depots to coastal ports, then embarked on ships bound for East Africa. The route carried them around the continent, through the Indian Ocean, and toward ports in Kenya. It was a voyage measured in weeks, not days. Transport capacity was limited and carefully scheduled. Soldiers boarded ships alongside vehicles, weapons, ammunition, and supplies intended to last until local supply systems could absorb them. Every ton mattered. The regiment's movement depended on imperial shipping lanes already strained by submarine threats in other theatres, adding urgency to every departure. By July and August 1940, Gold Coast battalions began arriving in Kenya. There they joined a growing concentration of forces drawn from across the British Empire. Units of the King's African Rifles were already established. South African formations arrived with modern equipment. Indian units added further manpower. Smaller contingents from other colonies filled out the force. What united these formations was not shared background or culture, but shared necessity. East Africa was not a secondary front. It was a vulnerable one. The environment quickly set itself apart from anything most of the Gold Coast soldiers had known. Kenya's highlands offered cooler temperatures, but training areas extended into dry plains and scrubland where heat, dust, and distance dominated daily routines. Roads were scarce, railways ended abruptly. Beyond established depots, movement depended on trucks, animals, and human labor. The East African force was being assembled in a region never designed to support large modern armies. Infrastructure lagged behind ambition. Every unit had to adapt. Training continued almost without pause. March discipline was tightened. Weapon handling was standardized across units. Officers worked to integrate West African battalions into a command structure shaped by British staff officers and informed by earlier colonial campaigns. Doctrine emphasized controlled movement, endurance, and maintaining order rather than dramatic battlefield clashes. Pressure continued to build. In August 1940, Italian forces advanced into British Somaliland. Though far to the northeast, the move sent a clear signal. Italian East Africa was not a passive garrison waiting to be attacked. It was capable of offensive action. For the Gold Coast Regiment, the campaign they had studied in theory was becoming real. They were still learning the ground, still absorbing routines and orders, when the strategic situation tightened around them. Preparation was no longer a phase with a clear endpoint. It blended directly into expectation. They had arrived not at the conclusion of training but at its edge. Ahead lay unfamiliar terrain, a capable enemy, and a campaign that would test whether preparation done far from the front could hold once the front finally appeared. As the regiment settled into new camps and adjusted to East African conditions, the question was no longer whether they would be used but how soon they would be sent forward. The first enemy the Gold Coast Regiment faced in East Africa did not wear a uniform or carry a rifle. It did not attack suddenly or retreat under pressure. It was the land itself. Kenya in mid-1940 was a place of sharp contrasts. Cool air in the highlands could fade quickly into dry heat on the plains. Grasslands stretched into scrub, then into open dusty ground where shade was rare and distances felt endless. Roads thinned into rough tracks, then vanished altogether. On maps, objectives appeared close. On foot, they were exhausting marches measured in hours, not miles. For the newly arrived West African battalions, this environment imposed lessons no parade ground could provide. Training was no longer about neat formations or perfect drills. It became about endurance, judgment, and survival. Every mistake carried a cost paid in fatigue, broken equipment, or illness. Training intensified almost immediately. Units were pushed out of static camps and into extended field exercises, designed to copy the conditions they would soon face across the border. Marches grew longer. Loads grew heavier. Full packs, rifles, ammunition, and water had to be carried over uneven ground. Movement became central to everything. Officers learned quickly that progress in East Africa could not be measured in how far a unit advanced on a given day. What mattered was whether water sources were secured, whether vehicles remained operational, and whether men stayed healthy enough to continue. A single broken truck or contaminated water point could halt an entire column. Disease was a constant concern. Malaria was already familiar to many soldiers from the Gold Coast, but East Africa's varied climate zones made it unpredictable. Medical officers enforced mosquito control measures with strict discipline. Nets were inspected. Camps were positioned carefully. Stagnant water was avoided when possible. Water discipline was drilled relentlessly. Soldiers were instructed when to drink, how much to drink, and when to conserve. Orders on hydration were followed as closely as orders on movement. In this campaign, illness could stop an advance just as effectively as enemy fire. Commanders treated disease as an operational threat, not a medical footnote. Supply limitations shaped every exercise. The East African force lacked the dense infrastructure available in Europe. Rail lines were few and easily disrupted. Beyond them, everything depended on motor transport, porters, and animal caravans. Trucks struggled on rough ground and broke down often. Spare parts were limited. Recovery could take days. Gold Coast units learned to operate within these limits. March schedules were adjusted to reduce strain. Loads were redistributed when men showed signs of exhaustion. Units practiced halting quickly and dispersing, reducing dust clouds that revealed their movement and easing pressure on narrow routes. These changes were not signs of disorder. They were practical adjustments grounded in colonial warfare doctrine, updated for a modern campaign. Integration with other forces became equally important. The Gold Coast Regiment trained alongside the King's African Rifles, whose long experience in East Africa gave them a clear advantage in reading terrain and weather. Joint exercises focused on coordination rather than competition. Units practiced moving together, sharing supply responsibilities, and covering one another's flanks. These exercises revealed differences in language, training backgrounds, and regimental traditions. Orders sometimes had to pass through multiple layers of explanation. Small misunderstandings could grow quickly in the field. British officers worked to standardize procedures, but real success depended on cooperation at lower levels. Non-commissioned officers played a crucial role. West African NCOs translated orders into action, enforced discipline during long marches, and held units together when fatigue weakened morale. As training moved farther from depots and deeper into rough ground, their importance became increasingly clear. Authority was no longer abstract, it was tested daily. Communications posed another challenge. Wireless radios were limited in number and often unreliable over broken terrain. Hills disrupted signals, batteries drained quickly. Field telephones required long lengths of wire that were difficult to lay and easy to damage. When lines failed, runners carried messages on foot across ground vehicles could not reach. Training accounted for these delays. Orders were written to allow for uncertainty. Junior officers were expected to act on intent rather than wait for perfect instructions. Initiative was encouraged, but always within clear limits. In East Africa, hesitation could be as dangerous as recklessness. By late summer 1940, the regiment began to understand the rhythm of operations in this theatre. Progress was deliberately slow. Speed without supply meant collapse. Every movement was planned backward from logistics rather than forward from objectives. Water points, fuel availability, and transport capacity dictated tempo. This approach differed sharply from popular images of colonial warfare as rapid and decisive. In reality, the campaign demanded patience. Commanders accepted that maintaining steady pressure mattered more than dramatic advances. The goal was to keep units functioning day after day. The wider strategic situation added urgency. Italian forces, though increasingly isolated from Italy itself, still held strong defensive positions across Ethiopia and Eritrea. Fortified posts remained intact. Airfields were operational. Intelligence reports suggested declining morale in some Italian units, but also warned against underestimating their firepower and local knowledge. For the Gold Coast Regiment, this meant weeks of preparation without direct contact. Combat remained distant, but strain was constant. The monotony of repeated exercises, the physical demands of the environment, and the awareness of an unseen enemy tested morale. Officers had to balance readiness with rest, discipline with endurance. By late 1940, signs of transition became visible. Training exercises increasingly resembled real operations. Reconnaissance patrols pushed closer to border areas. Maps were updated with new routes and terrain notes. Briefings shifted from hypothetical situations to named locations and real objectives. The regiment's role within the larger East African force was becoming clearer. Gold Coast battalions were no longer treated simply as reinforcements. They were being positioned deliberately within operational plans, expected to move, hold ground, and operate independently when required. They were no longer just learning East Africa, they were being placed inside it. As the dry season approached and Allied commanders prepared to shift from defense to offense, the regiment stood at the edge of a new phase. The lessons of terrain, supply, and endurance had been learned under controlled conditions. Soon, those lessons would be tested against an enemy who had built his empire on the same ground. And when the orders finally came, there would be little time left to learn. By the second half of 1940, Italian East Africa stood at both its broadest reach and its weakest point. From the Ethiopian highlands to the Somali coast, Italian forces controlled a vast territory. On maps, the empire appeared solid and imposing. On the ground, it was held together by long supply lines, limited roads, and confidence shaped more by imperial ambition than by practical strength. Italy had entered the war believing distance would serve as protection. Isolated from the Mediterranean and cut off from regular reinforcement, Italian commanders understood that support from Europe would be slow and uncertain. Their answer was speed. By striking quickly at nearby British territories, they hoped to force London to divert attention and resources away from more important fronts. This thinking shaped Italian strategy in East Africa. Existing garrisons were expected to do more than defend. They were ordered to act offensively while they still had fuel, ammunition, and morale. The goal was to seize territory early, before British forces could concentrate. The advance into British Somaliland in August 1940 was the clearest sign of this approach. Italian columns moved forward with artillery and air support, overwhelming defenders who were badly outnumbered. The operation succeeded tactically and sent a shock through British planning circles. If Italian forces could strike there, Kenya itself appeared exposed. Across East Africa, the balance felt uncertain. Italian troops occupied strong positions. Their airfields were active. Their garrisons were spread widely, but still intact. For Allied commanders, the threat was real and immediate, yet intelligence assessments offered a more careful picture. Italian forces were numerous but uneven. Some units were well trained and equipped, others were colonial Askari formations with mixed levels of training and loyalty. Equipment stocks were limited, fuel had to be rationed, ammunition could not be wasted. Once Italian supplies were used up, they could not be easily replaced. Every truck lost, every shell fired, every aircraft damaged reduced their ability to hold ground. This reality shaped British planning. Commanders such as Lieutenant General Sir Alan Cunningham, who led the East African Force, began to design a response that avoided direct confrontation where possible. The objective was not to defeat Italian forces everywhere at once, but to stretch them. Pressure would be applied steadily, forcing Italian units to move, withdraw, and consume resources they could not replace. Mobility became the guiding idea. Rather than massing troops for a single decisive blow, Allied forces would advance on multiple axes, threatening supply lines and forcing Italian commanders to make difficult choices. Ground would be taken gradually, but once taken, it would be held. Within this strategy, the Gold Coast Regiment was given a role that matched its strengths. West African battalions were valued for their endurance, discipline, and ability to operate over long distances in difficult conditions. They were not expected to lead armoured thrusts or storm heavily fortified cities alone. Instead, they would secure routes, protect flanks, pressure withdrawing enemy units, and hold ground behind advancing formations. Their work would be steady rather than dramatic, but essential to keeping the campaign moving forward. Preparation shifted to match this role. Briefings focused on Italian defensive layouts, known road networks, and the geography of southern Ethiopia. Officers studied intelligence reports that highlighted where Italian positions were strong and where they were thin. Weak points mattered more than strongholds. The campaign was expected to be decided not by large battles but by forcing the enemy to keep moving under constant strain. Each withdrawal would cost the Italians fuel, morale, and cohesion. Over time, this pressure would become unbearable. Italian morale became a central concern. Reports suggested growing isolation among units stationed far from major towns. Many soldiers knew they were cut off from Italy. Early confidence, reinforced by air power and colonial authority, began to fade as Allied control of the skies improved. The psychological balance was slowly shifting. For the Gold Coast Regiment, the enemy was no longer an abstract idea. Italian uniforms, weapons, and tactics were studied closely. Soldiers learned how Italian units defended positions, how they withdrew, and how they used terrain. Training briefings grew more specific, replacing general warnings with detailed expectations. Orders also clarified where West African battalions fit within the larger Allied structure. They would operate alongside South African brigades, units of the King's African Rifles, and Ethiopian Patriot forces preparing to rise against occupation. Coordination across languages, units, and command cultures would be essential. Command structure mattered deeply. British officers coordinated planning at higher levels, but execution depended on cohesion at the battalion and company levels. Units would often operate at some distance from immediate support. The campaign demanded independent movement, rapid decision-making, and restraint. Overextension was dangerous. Advancing too quickly risked supply failure. Pursuing too aggressively risked an ambush. Caution, when combined with persistence, was increasingly seen as a strength rather than a weakness. As December 1940 approached, preparations for Allied counteroffensives accelerated along the Kenya-Ethiopia frontier. Supply dumps were established. Transport columns were assigned carefully. Every truck, every mule, every porter was counted and scheduled. Nothing was left to chance. The emphasis was not simply on speed. It was on sustaining pressure once movement began. Commanders understood that stopping mid-advance could undo weeks of progress. Once the offensive started, it had to continue. For the men of the Gold Coast Regiment, the waiting ended quietly. There were no speeches or formal announcements. Orders moved through familiar channels, naming border areas, advance routes, and assembly points. The tone was practical, not dramatic. The regiment would move as part of a larger force, advancing into territory that had been under Italian control for years. There was little expectation of a quick victory. Instead, there was an understanding that success would depend on endurance, discipline, and steady movement. Ahead lay a campaign shaped by distance and strain, not sudden clashes. The Italian threat remained real, but it was already weakened by isolation. The task now was to apply pressure patiently and relentlessly until that weakness turned into collapse. With that, the Gold Coast Regiment prepared to leave training behind and step into a war that would be decided not by moments of spectacle, but by miles covered and ground held, one march at a time. Movement replaced maneuver the moment the advance began. In January 1941, Allied forces crossed from Kenya into southern Ethiopia, not with sweeping attacks or fast breakthroughs, but with carefully paced columns designed to remain supplied as they moved. For the Gold Coast Regiment, this marked a clear shift from months of preparation to sustained operations in hostile territory. The ground asserted itself immediately. Roads were few and often little more than worn tracks cut into earth and stone. Many bridges had been damaged or destroyed. Vehicles struggled on steep slopes and rocky surfaces, forcing infantry to move ahead on foot, while engineers and transport units worked behind them to keep supply lines open. Progress was slow by design. An advance measured in hours could consume an entire day. Italian resistance during these early stages was uneven. In some areas, small outposts withdrew after brief contact, conserving strength and avoiding encirclement. In others, Italian units fought short, delaying actions, using terrain to slow Allied movement before retreating northward. These encounters were rarely decisive on their own, but together they served a purpose. They bought time, exhausted attackers, and consumed supplies. For the Gold Coast Regiment, combat often took the form of pressure rather than confrontation. Battalions were tasked with securing routes, guarding flanks, and protecting transport columns as they moved forward. Their responsibility was not to break through heavily defended positions, but to ensure that once ground was taken, it remained secure. This work demanded discipline under constant strain. Long marches were followed by immediate duties, setting up perimeters, conducting patrols, and maintaining night security. Rest came in short intervals. Fatigue accumulated quietly, carried forward from one day to the next. Coordination with Ethiopian Patriot forces became increasingly important as the advance moved deeper into occupied territory. Local fighters offered intelligence on Italian movements, road conditions, water sources, and defensive positions. Their knowledge of terrain often proved more accurate than maps. It helped Allied units avoid ambushes and identify weak points in Italian deployments. At the same time, British commanders worked carefully to maintain control. Cooperation was encouraged, but discipline remained essential. The campaign's success depended on restraint as much as speed. Reprisals or uncontrolled actions risked undermining local support and disrupting operations. Supply remained the defining limit of every decision. Motor transport columns stretched back toward Kenya, vulnerable to weather, terrain, and mechanical failure. When trucks broke down, porters and pack animals filled the gaps. Every battalion learned quickly that moving faster than supplies allowed meant stopping altogether. Water was often the most urgent concern. Wells were scarce and sometimes unusable. Rivers changed with the season. Units planned movements around known water points, adjusting routes when sources proved unreliable. Logistics dictated tempo more strictly than enemy resistance. By February 1941, signs of Italian strain were becoming clear. Ammunition shortages grew more common. Fuel stocks dwindled. Units that had once been prepared to defend fixed positions now found themselves forced into retreat under steady pressure. Withdrawal replaced defense as the dominant Italian response. Allied air superiority added to this pressure. Italian movements were increasingly visible from the air, while Allied columns moved with greater confidence. Communication between Italian units suffered. Morale declined as isolation became impossible to ignore. The Gold Coast Regiment advanced steadily through this changing environment. Officers adjusted plans daily. Routes were altered to avoid broken bridges or impassable ground. Objectives shifted as intelligence improved. Flexibility mattered more than rigid schedules. Success was measured not in dramatic captures but in maintaining cohesion. Units that stayed supplied, rested when possible, and moved in coordination with neighboring formations continued to advance. Those who pushed too hard risked collapse. Commanders learned to balance urgency with caution. As March 1941 approached, the larger pattern became clear. Italian resistance was breaking down unevenly, sector by sector. Some areas fell quickly, others required sustained pressure over weeks. There was no single moment of collapse, only a gradual erosion of control. The road toward the Ethiopian capital was opening, not through a decisive battle, but through accumulated effort across hundreds of miles. Each secured route, each abandoned position, and each successful march shortened the distance. For the men on the ground, the political meaning of this progress was still abstract. What they knew was physical reality, the weight of packs, the dust that clung to uniforms, the constant calculation of distance and water. The campaign's turning point felt more like a shift in rhythm than a victory. The enemy was retreating more often than standing its ground. The Gold Coast Regiment continued northward, step by step. The pace remained deliberate. No one expected a sudden end. Yet with each mile covered, the center of Italian authority drew closer. Ahead lay Addis Ababa, not as a fortified prize to be stormed, but as a symbol waiting to be reached. And for a campaign built on endurance rather than spectacle, that moment would soon become its most visible result. The fall of Addis Ababa came quietly, without the final battle many had expected. On the 6th of April 1941, Allied forces entered the Ethiopian capital not through shattered defences or ruined streets, but through a city already emptied of Italian authority. The centre of Italian East Africa had ceased to function before the first columns arrived. Italian commanders understood what the advance had made unavoidable. Their forces were cut off from resupply, pressured from several directions, and unable to defend the capital without risking complete encirclement. Holding Addis Ababa no longer made military sense. Withdrawal, not defense, became the only option left. The decision spared the city from large-scale destruction, but it marked the effective end of Italian rule in Ethiopia. What had once been presented as a permanent empire collapsed in days, undone not by a single defeat, but by months of steady pressure and logistical exhaustion. For the Gold Coast Regiment, the entry into Addis Ababa was not a moment of celebration. It was a change in task. Units were assigned security duties almost immediately. Key roads, administrative buildings, communication centers, and supply depots had to be guarded. The mission was no longer about advancing, but about controlling. Order mattered. Addis Ababa had lived under occupation for years, and the sudden absence of Italian authority created uncertainty. Civilians waited to see what would follow. Allied commanders understood the political weight of the moment. The capital was more than a military objective, it was a symbol. Restraint was emphasized at every level. British officers issued clear instructions to prevent looting, reprisals, or disorder. Ethiopian sovereignty, though not yet fully restored in practice, had to be respected in appearance and intent. The return of Emperor Haile Selassie was being prepared, and the conduct of Allied troops would shape how liberation was remembered. Gold Coast units carried out their duties with discipline, guards were posted, patrols were organized, movements were regulated to avoid confusion or conflict with civilians. These tasks lacked the drama of combat, but they were essential. A city taken without control could be lost without a fight. Within the capital, the collapse of Italian administration became visible almost immediately. Government offices stood abandoned, supply depots were left unused, files and equipment lay where they had been dropped. Communication networks fell silent. The systems that had enforced imperial rule simply stopped working. For many soldiers, this sudden emptiness was striking. The Italian authority had not been defeated in the streets, it had withdrawn, leaving behind the shell of control without its substance. The speed of the collapse underscored how fragile the empire had become. Despite the absence of major fighting in the city, danger remained. Italian units still operated beyond Addis Ababa, particularly in mountainous regions to the north and west. Intelligence reports warned against complacency. Isolated resistance, sabotage, or surprise attacks were still possible. The war in East Africa had changed shape, but it had not ended. Beyond the capital, Italian commanders regrouped what remained of their forces in terrain better suited to defense. Mountain ranges, narrow passes, and remote valleys offered cover and natural protection. From these positions, resistance could continue even as the central authority dissolved. British planners anticipated this shift. The campaign's focus shifted from rapid movement to sustained pressure. Clearing remaining pockets of resistance would require time, coordination, and careful use of limited resources. For the Gold Coast Regiment, this meant that their work in Addis Ababa was temporary. Once the order was established and responsibilities transferred, units prepared to move again. The capital had been reached, but the campaign's hardest work still lay ahead. As April 1941 turned into May, the broader picture became clearer. Italian East Africa no longer existed as a unified force. What remained were scattered units, each fighting for survival rather than victory. Supply shortages worsened, morale declined further. Communication between Italian groups became unreliable. The Gold Coast Regiment, like other Allied units, adjusted to this new phase. Marches resumed. Supply lines stretched even farther. Fatigue deepened. The nature of the fighting shifted from advance to pursuit, from movement to containment. The symbolic center of the campaign had fallen, but symbols alone did not end wars. The dismantling of Italian control required patience and persistence, the same qualities that had carried the regiment through the long months of preparation and advance. Addis Ababa had fallen without a last stand, but the campaign itself was not over. In the mountains ahead, Italian forces prepared to resist for a little longer, and once again, the Gold Coast Regiment would be required to move forward, not toward a capital, but into a war that refused to end quickly. The empire's collapse had begun. The task now was to ensure it could not rebuild itself, even in retreat. As Addis Ababa slipped behind them, the war narrowed rather than ended. Italian East Africa no longer functioned as a single empire, but its fragments continued to fight on. Units withdrew into regions where distance, altitude, and rough ground could partly offset their declining strength. For the Gold Coast Regiment, the months after the capture of the capital proved to be some of the most demanding of the entire campaign. The focus shifted to the Ethiopian highlands. Steep ridges, narrow passes, and broken plateaus defined the landscape. Roads were few, and often little more than winding tracks cut into mountainsides. In these areas, even small defensive positions could delay an advance for days. Italian commanders hoped that terrain could achieve what logistics no longer could. What Italian units lacked in fuel, ammunition, and air support, they tried to make up for with position and persistence. Some retreated to prepared strongpoints, others scattered into smaller groups, relying on ambushes and sudden withdrawals to slow Allied movement. The aim was no longer victory, but survival and delay. Operations in mid-1941 slowed and became more cautious. Allied columns advanced step by step, securing routes before pushing deeper into the interior. Each valley had to be cleared before the next could be entered. Supply lines stretched farther with every mile gained, and each additional mile increased the risk of failure. Transport difficulties multiplied. Trucks struggled on steep gradients and rough surfaces. Engines overheated. The brakes failed. When vehicles could not pass, animals were used to carry the load. When animals failed, men carried loads themselves. Progress depended on both physical effort and planning. For the Gold Coast Regiment, this phase demanded patience. Advances were rarely dramatic. Days could pass with little visible movement, followed by sudden bursts of activity as resistance was encountered and cleared. The absence of clear front lines made the campaign unpredictable. Fatigue became a defining condition. Many soldiers had been on the move for months with little rest. Rotations were difficult to arrange, as manpower was needed everywhere. Medical officers reported rising exhaustion alongside familiar illnesses. Feet blistered, uniforms wore thin, small injuries accumulated. Discipline and routine became essential tools. Non-commissioned officers enforced march schedules, rest periods, and camp organization. These routines preserved cohesion when morale was strained. Without them, units risked breaking down under the weight of constant effort. Italian resistance varied widely by location. In some areas, isolated units surrendered after brief contact. Recognizing the futility of continued fighting, supplies were gone. Communication with higher command had broken down. For these soldiers, surrender was a practical choice. Elsewhere, resistance was more stubborn. Small groups conducted ambushes along narrow roads or in wooded valleys. These actions were designed to delay rather than defeat. They forced Allied units to move carefully, protect supply columns, and remain alert even far from major objectives. The Gold Coast Regiment's tasks reflected the changing nature of the campaign. Patrols replaced advances, security duties expanded. Units guarded supply routes, escorted convoys, and searched remote positions where Italian forces were believed to be hiding. Success was measured not by territory gained, but by the steady reduction of enemy capability. Coordination remained multinational. British command structures continued to direct operations, while local intelligence played an increasingly important role. Ethiopian patriots provided information on tracks, water sources, and Italian hideouts. Their knowledge helped locate resistance that might otherwise have remained hidden. British officers worked carefully to balance cooperation with control. Patriot forces were valuable allies, but discipline and coordination were necessary to avoid confusion or unintended violence. Maintaining order was as important as defeating the remaining resistance. By late summer 1941, the overall pattern became unmistakable. Italian units were increasingly isolated. Food shortages were common. Ammunition was scarce. Medical support was minimal. Without reinforcement or resupply, resistance steadily weakened. The campaign became one of endurance rather than maneuver. Instead of seeking decisive engagements, Allied forces focused on containment and attrition. Italian positions were bypassed where possible, cut off from supplies, and pressured until surrender became unavoidable. The final surrender of organized Italian forces in East Africa came in November 1941. The announcement marked the end of a campaign that had begun with Italian confidence and imperial ambition, and ended in fragmentation and exhaustion. For the Gold Coast Regiment, the conclusion was quiet. There were no large ceremonies or public celebrations. Orders were issued confirming that the last pockets of resistance had been neutralized. Units were instructed to halt major operations and prepare for reorganization. What remained was the aftermath. Equipment was worn, vehicles require repair, soldiers were exhausted. The hardest part of the campaign, many realized, had not been the advance itself, but the sustained effort required to finish it. Victory had been earned slowly. The regiment had proven itself not in moments of spectacle, but in months of persistence. It had adapted to terrain, supply limits, and constant pressure without losing cohesion. These qualities had carried it through the final phase of the campaign. As operations finally slowed, another question began to surface. With the war in East Africa over, what would this experience mean for the regiment's future? Where would these lessons be used next? And would the contribution of West African soldiers be remembered once attention shifted to larger and more dramatic theatres? The empire they had fought against had faded into fragments. What remained was the record of endurance left behind by those who had helped bring it to an end. The campaign in East Africa ended without a parade, and for many of the men who fought it, without an audience. When the final organized Italian resistance collapsed in November 1941, attention shifted quickly to other fronts. North Africa demanded urgent focus. The Mediterranean grew more dangerous. Soon, the war would expand deeper into Asia. There was little pause to reflect on what had been achieved in the Horn of Africa. For the Gold Coast Regiment, the end of operations did not mean immediate rest. Units were reorganized, equipment was repaired, replaced, or written off as worn beyond use. Vehicles that had survived months of rough terrain were inspected carefully. Soldiers were rotated where possible, though manpower demands limited how much relief could be provided. Some men were marked for future deployments, others remained in garrison roles, waiting for new orders. The regiment had completed its task in East Africa, but the war was far from over. Experience, not celebration, was the main outcome. Within British military circles, the East African campaign was often described as efficient and well managed. It was not remembered for dramatic battles or sudden breakthroughs, but for steady progress under difficult conditions. Logistics, coordination, and endurance had shaped the outcome more than firepower alone. For West African units, including the Gold Coast Regiment, this assessment carried quite importance. The campaign had shown that African infantry could operate effectively over long distances, in harsh terrain, and within complex multinational forces. They had not simply followed orders, they had adapted, sustained pressure, and held ground under constant strain. These lessons did not disappear when the campaign ended. Officers who had served in East Africa carried that experience into later theatres. March discipline, careful supply planning, climate awareness, and small unit initiative all influenced how West African troops were used in future operations. The regiment's performance also affected perceptions within the army. East Africa marked a shift. The Gold Coast Regiment was no longer seen only as a force suited to local defence or limited colonial tasks. It had proven itself capable of sustained operations against a modern imperial army. That reputation would shape its later deployments. Yet recognition remained uneven. Official histories summarized campaigns and commanders, often leaving individual regiments in the background. Casualty figures varied between records. Some losses were clearly documented, others were not. Unit-level accounts were scattered across war diaries, reports, and personal recollections. The absence of a single defining battle worked against public memory. There was no famous date or location that could easily represent the campaign. Without dramatic images or widely known names, East Africa faded from popular attention even as its strategic importance remained clear. For the soldiers themselves, the meaning of the campaign was personal rather than symbolic. They remembered long marches, water shortages, illness, and fatigue. They remembered operating far from home, under unfamiliar command structures, in a war whose political goals were explained but rarely discussed among the ranks. Survival, cohesion, and completing assigned tasks became their measures of success. Pride, where it existed, was quiet. It rested in knowing that the regiment had held together under pressure and carried out its role as required. After 1941, many veterans moved on to new fronts. Some would later serve in Asia, facing different terrain and a different enemy. Others returned home carrying experiences that did not always fit easily into post-war life. The war had widened their horizons, but it had not always provided a platform for their voices. Demobilization after the war offered limited space for reflection. Colonial records focused on numbers and movements rather than memory. Personal stories were often passed down privately within families and communities rather than formally recorded. Over time, the East African campaign became a footnote for general audiences. Its quiet efficiency worked against its visibility. There were no iconic photographs, no single battlefield name repeated in textbooks. Yet the outcome was decisive. Italian East Africa ceased to exist as a military entity, and Allied control of the region reshaped the balance of power across the continent. For the Gold Coast Regiment, this result had been earned through persistence rather than spectacle. Their contribution lay in holding ground, maintaining movement, and operating within a system that depended on reliability above all else. It was a form of warfare that rarely produces legends but often determines outcomes. The memory of that service survives unevenly. It appears in war diaries, in casualty lists, and in fragments of oral history. Where it does appear, the story is consistent. It is a story of soldiers who adapted to an unfamiliar war, endured difficult conditions, and carried out their roles without expecting recognition. In East Africa, the Gold Coast Regiment proved what it could do. It showed that training done far from the front could hold under pressure, and that endurance could defeat an enemy weakened by distance and isolation. These lessons became part of the Army's broader experience, even if they were not always openly acknowledged. The regiment's war in East Africa did not truly end in November 1941. It continued in the methods adopted later, in the confidence placed in African units, and in the quiet understanding among those who had served that victory did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrived in measured steps, along difficult roads, sustained by discipline and patience. And in that sense, the legacy of the Gold Coast Regiment in East Africa rests not in dramatic moments, but in the distance covered, the pressure maintained, and the task completed, steadily and without pause, until an empire faded and the war moved on. This campaign was won far from headlines, by endurance, discipline, and soldiers whose history is often overlooked. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story so their service isn't forgotten. More untold World War II campaigns are coming. Stay with us as we keep bringing them to light.